Hi, I'm Rebecca, and that's Doug. Welcome to Killer Meals. Today we are dining with Douglas Franklin Wright, and this is his last meal. Douglas Franklin Wright was convicted of the murders of 3 people and executed in the state of Oregon in 1996 by lethal injection. But let's start at the beginning. Wright was born March 25, 1940 in Spirit Lake, Iowa. His childhood was peppered with periodic sexual and physical abuse at the hands of his alcoholic and otherwise neglectful parents. When he was a teen, he dropped out of high school and eventually joined the Marines. His military career didn't last long, however, as he was dishonorably discharged in his early 20s for sexually assaulting a 5-year-old boy in California.
What a piece of
Wright would later admit to his parole officer that he had molested at least 70 boys in his life. Fast forward to the rest of the 1960s, where Wright found himself in jail after being arrested for multiple break-ins and assaults. This would be his first of many stints in prison. After being released, Wright quickly escalated his physical violence. On September 4th, 1969, the same year that legendary rock band Chicago released their debut album, Chicago Transit Authority, Wright broke into the Portland home of 71-year-old Margaret Rosenberry. Inside, he found Margaret, her 27-year-old granddaughter Gail Snelling, and Gail's 5-year-old son. Gail and her grandmother, Margaret, were fatally shot by Wright after he entered the home. After murdering the 2 women, Wright abducted Gail's son. He took the child to several different motels where he proceeded to sexually assault him. Thankfully, Wright did eventually let him go. A month-long manhunt ensued, and Wright was only caught after he shot a man by the name of Don Kennison in a billiards hall over a game of pool. Wright was tried and convicted of the murders of Rosenberry and Snelling. When asked why he did it, Wright responded that he had always wanted a son of his own. So end of story, right? He goes to prison and eventually eats a honey bun, and now we're here talking about it? That couldn't be more Douglas Franklin wrong. Wright was paroled. Yes, paroled. In 1982, after serving only 12 years of his 35-year sentence because he was considered a model prisoner. Unsurprisingly to everyone except apparently the parole board, immediately upon his release, Wright committed a series of armed robberies, threatening to kill anyone who tried to stop him. During his robbery spree, Wright abducted another child, 10-year-old Luke Treadway, nicknamed Luke Skywalker by his friends, right off the streets as he was walking home from a friend's house. In a letter to the Oregonian prior to his execution, Wright described the abduction of Luke. About 4:30 p.m., May 23, 1984, Luke left his friend's house located on the same street as his own. There was a bridge located between his friend's house and his own, and while walking across this bridge, I picked the boy up. Luke pointed out his home and his mother, who was standing at her front door talking to a neighbor. She was unaware that the 1965 green Volkswagen driving by contained her son.
so scary. It is. Can you imagine?
He went on to say that he was hunting for teenage boys that day, and Luke happened to just be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Wright brought the boy back to his apartment, where he molested him for a day and a half. On the morning of May 25th, 1984, fearing the humiliation of going to prison for the abduction and molestation of a young boy, Wright drove Luke to a remote part of Wasco County while he slept in the back seat. While he was still sleeping, Wright shot him in the head with a .22 automatic. He picked up Luke, took him down a small incline, and buried him under some brush. Wright described in the letter to the Oregonian how he sat with the body and cried. He later referred to Luke's murder as a cowardly act on his part. Wright was arrested and sent to prison shortly after, not for the murder of Luke Treadway, but for another series of robberies for which he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite exhausting searches and Luke's picture even being featured on milk cartons in the region, his murder would be unsolved for the next 12 years. and his body would never be found. Okay, so he's back in prison. Here comes the Honeybun, right?
Douglas Franklin wrong again.
After serving only 7 years of his 30-year sentence, Wright was
Paroled again.
in June of 1991. By October of the same year, Wright was essentially urban hunting his victims. By placing ads in the local paper advertising well-paying work clearing brush at a youth camp, Wright was luring unhoused men to the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. On October 13, 1991, 26-year-old Randy Scott Henry and 31-year-old Anthony Sean Tiny Nelson accepted Wright's offer for work and followed him into a remote section of the reservation. Wright brought them food, drove them further into the desert, and offered them alcohol. As the men drank, Wright fatally shot Nelson in the head with a pistol. Henry, however, jumped out of the car and, while being shot at by Wright, managed to get away, make his way back to Portland, and notify the authorities. He led the police directly to Wright, and he was apprehended again. Wright later said of Henry, "I'm thankful that you got away. I saw you again a few hours later on Northeast Burnside Ave. I still know why I let you go. Maybe I just had the power. I apologize, Randy, and I wish you a long life." In addition to Nelson, police learned that during the same month, Wright murdered 3 other men in similar fashion: 27-year-old Anthony Barker, 23-year-old William Marks, and 37-year-old William Davis. All were unhoused men Wright lured to the reservation with the promise of work. In the end, Douglas Franklin Wright was only convicted of 5 murders, but is known to have killed at least 7 people during his 22-year murder spree. He himself hinted that he has more victims, including an elderly man in Florida he believes he beat to death one night for 30 cents to buy a hamburger, although it has never been proven. Wright was convicted of the murders of Barker, Marks, and Davis. He was indicted on the murder of Nelson, but because Nelson was a Native American, he was never tried of the murder, as it would have had to have been done in federal court. Per the Major Crimes Act, killing a Native American on an Indian reservation is a federal crime. On October 11, 1993, 2 years after brutally murdering these men in the desert, Douglas Franklin Wright was sentenced to death for the murders of Barker, Marks, and Davis. Wright waived his right to appeals and even sped up his execution by actually asking to be executed. He wrote, "On the morning of September 6th, I'm going to be gone, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm gone forever. I'm leaving a very violent past. I'm a very evil person. I've done nothing but bad all my life, done nothing but hurt people and stole people's money. I hurt all my friends. I'm a disgrace to my family, disgrace to everybody else." Shortly before his execution, Wright sent his infamous letter to the Oregonian confessing to the abduction and murder of Luke Treadway, which at this time was still unsolved. He invited the Treadway family to his execution in an apparent attempt to offer them closure, which they declined. Robert Treadway, Luke's brother, said of the invitation, "What would be the point? That would give him the satisfaction. Yes, I want something to happen to him, but as far as being there and seeing it, that is giving him some kind of satisfaction. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't give him even a little satisfaction. It hit me kind of hard. I always had hope, always. I never believed he could be dead at that time. I was 13 and I couldn't understand why it could happen. It tore our family apart." In the letter, he briefly addresses other victims and their families. To Gail Snelling's son, he wrote, "To who lost his mother and grandmother, I'm so sorry. To whom it may concern, I was the sole perpetrator of the Snelling-Rosenberry murders." And to the man who led to his initial murder arrest, he said, "To Don Kennison, I apologize for shooting you during our 1969 fight at Banks. I'm thankful that you're alive. I think we both should stay away from pool tables." The budget for Wright's execution was $200,000, which included extensive Salem and Oregon State Police presence, overtime for prison guards and personnel, equipment costs, and the melon and pastries the execution duty personnel ate that evening. On September 6, 1996, at 12:06 a.m., onlookers watched as the first of 3 drug cocktails were administered to Wright intravenously. Brian Smith of the Oregonian describes the execution. Janice Downing, mother of William Marks, sat in a wheelchair wearing a lavender jacket over a simple floral dress. Wright's eyes frantically searched the spectators, seeming to calm as they landed on her. Her son, dead, all for wanting to work to pay his own way in the world. For this, she wished her face to be the last face Wright saw before he died. He granted it. They stared at each other for a moment. Wright mouthed a simple phrase, "I'm sorry." And after a stoic Downing nodded, he lay his head down, closed his eyes, opened them, and waited for death. Smith writes, he had wanted death. Now that was all there was, death and waiting for death. At 12:06 a.m., Wright took his last few breaths. A few minutes later, a voice came over the loudspeaker. "This is Frank Thompson, Superintendent of Oregon State Penitentiary. The execution of Douglas Franklin Wright has been carried out." Douglas Franklin Wright was pronounced dead at 12:16 a.m. He asked for a singular honey bun as his last meal.
The honey really comes through. They're soft.
It's like the best pear food I've ever had.
They're lacy. They're airy. That's a good honey bun. Thanks for watching. Be sure to give us a like and subscribe. We'll see you next week for your reservation at Killer Meals.